Well, thank you very much. And my brief in 14 minutes and 57 seconds is to tell you a story about oil. It's a story about risk as well. It's the risk that in our oil-dependent, nay, oil-addicted world, our general expectation that supplies of this vital lifeblood will keep growing in pace with demand, that expectation will be disappointed. And it'll be disappointed potentially catastrophically within just a few short years on our watch. That's the risk. It's a personal story. In 1978, when it started, I was very much a devotee of the oil industry. Newly armed with a PhD in geology, I joined the faculty at Imperial College here in London. And I was 24 years old, the token young faculty member. This is a sweatshop for training cannon fodder for the oil and mining industries. And I would sit in the common room with my fellow faculty, including ex-chief geologists of companies like BP, quite faint with admiration and self-importance. I also went looking for oil. I was going to try and do this sort of sneaky mail thing of shuffling the cue cards, but I think I'm going to do the Sarah Demant, no, keep it there, the grand gesture. I used to go looking for oil here in Baluchistan in 1984, for example. This is probably where Osama bin Laden is hanging out right now. I'm afraid that I didn't find any oil, but one of my colleagues at Imperial College did in a neighbouring province, and there was a famous party thrown in consequence, after which lectures were cancelled for days afterwards. Even in those days, geologists used to tell porkies about the numbers concerning oil. Generally then, it was understatement. So someone would find an oil field, they'd say it was X barrels, and in actual fact, it was X plus 50%, but they keep that 50% back for next year so that they could demonstrate that vital thing in the world of commerce, year upon year growth. That was to change, as I will seek briefly to persuade you. Going into the early 1980s, I made my first big mistake in life. I was very comfortable in my conservative oil-centric world, but I started reading The Guardian. And I discovered, for example, that I was rather anguished about the concept of cruise missiles in the lanes of Berkshire and other such things that agitate Guardian readers. And then I found something I was really agitated about, a little bit before the time it was fashionable so to be, global warming. And I set about trying to campaign on this as something that was central to what would become the rest of my life. The idea that when you burn oil, coal and gas, the fossil fuels, you put heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere, and this general kind of thing is the consequence. I quit my first job in what was then probably one of the most conservative universities in the world, and I joined one of the then most radical environment groups, Greenpeace, to try and do something about global warming and other stuff to do with oil. So wherever you could find a disaster or a danger in the oil industry, as I saw it, you would tend to find me sort of waving a flag of warning, tooling around in oil spills in places like Spain and Alaska. This, I thought, was something that was worth campaigning on, but I never imagined then that there might be a problem with the oil industry's measurement of its asset base. Others had more insight than me, fortunately. Colin Campbell, ex-BP, in 1998 blew a very loud whistle in which he said, you know what, we discovered the most oil we ever will discover way back in the 1960s. And I think that a few decades on, that's going to mean a peak in production and a collapse, a descent, maybe even a steep enough descent to be called a collapse. And he was borrowing an idea that had come earlier from a guy from Shell, Marion King Hubbert, who predicted in 1956, based on the pattern of discovery of oil in domestic America, the lower 48, that there would be a peak in production out in 1971. He was scorned by his peers, he was vilified even, and he was bang on, absolutely right. Campbell too was treated really badly by his peers at that time. I thought then, in 1978, when I read that paper of his in Scientific American, that, this can't be right. It had worrying data in it, but with my blue chip, gold-plated education, all I could come up with was he must have got something wrong. And that was the extent of my analysis. And really and truly, it taught me a lesson, because I think, when we're comfortable or when we're very busy and we're presented with a risk assessment that involves a really uncomfortable analysis, our tendency is to back the comforting story even to the subordination of reason. So I wanted to set about forming a considered opinion on this subject. By this time, I'd set up a solar energy company. That was the day job, but I was reading a lot more than The Guardian. So I became convinced of this peak oil story after a few months of looking at it and meeting some of the peakists. What do you do when you're a campaigner, or you feel the need to campaign and you've got something to campaign about? Well, of course, you write a book, and that would be the next picture. I got it out of date. This book made the case that we will, sadly, if the analysis is correct, suffer a descent, maybe a collapse of global oil production within a few years. It got good reviews. I got to be interviewed by Rosie Boycott at the Hay Festival. But of course, only about 43 people bought the book. And I think most of that was my mum in a bulk order. And that's tends to be what happens to books about uncomfortable narratives. So I also did about a bit of what we campaigners call outreach. I tried to go to some of my old graduate student mates, who by this time were impossibly senior in companies like BP. And I sat in the boardroom at BP with Tony Hayward, my old graduate student colleague, and had a very fine breakfast, and he accused me of scaremongering, along with the other peakists with whom I was then typecast. So, what do you do about that? You then go to the government and you try and say, well, let's form a task force, an industry government task force to look at this risk question. And I was assured by the chief economist at the then Department of Trade and Industry, we are not going to do a risk analysis, Dr. Leggett, because there is no risk. So what to do? It had moved on. This is 2007. Do you write another book to update it? One or two more people had joined the whistleblowing by that time. And I thought, no, that's not the thing to do. The world is full of middle-aged men with a bee in their bonnet and a book about it. So what we should try and do is set up an industry task force. If the government won't do it with us, let's try and do it as a group of companies. So I got together with a few other people from different companies, and we came up with an analysis which doesn't make particularly comfortable reading, but it has to be dealt with. We think now all these companies together, the CEOs and the chairman, Virgin, Scottish and Southern, Arup, Stagecoach, the transport company, one or two others actually, that this problem is as bad as the credit crunch and probably worse. This is a sort of sobering analysis, because with the credit crunch, what you had warning about the financial crash were one or two maverick economists, albeit some of them with Nobel Prizes, some far-sighted journalists like Gillian Tett at the Financial Times, and that was pretty much it. The bonus cultists, of course, vilified these people and ridiculed them and said they were scaremongering, that S word that you see in debates of this kind. And we now know, painfully, who was right in that question. Here, we have a number of people within and around the oil industry. We have certain military intelligence organizations speaking out about it, and we have a cross-section of British industry blowing a whistle about what's likely to happen in the next few years. So just to emphasize quickly the stakes here, there have been two global energy crises before, in the 70s and 80s. We think this one could be even worse, and the reason is that the analysis, this isn't a conspiracy, it's a cultural thing, it's a failure of human culture. It's the same way the bonus cultists were wrong about their mortgage-backed securities. that the oil industry will wake up one day to the fact that it's wrong about what it's telling us. And then that will apply to the oil-producing countries as much as the oil-consuming ones. And here you see Dubai in 1990, and watch those three towers in the foreground. Here you see Dubai in 2007, and there are multi-$100 billion and multi-100 billion ruble domestic infrastructure programs in these countries. And when the peak realization comes, they will start husbanding their own resources, and they will keep a lot of the oil back. So for some, maybe many oil-consuming countries, that's us, this will be experienced not as energy crisis, but energy famine. And it could happen very quickly. So this is a big warning. How are we going to try and get it out? We opted for a press conference at the London Stock Exchange in October 2008. And for those of you who know your history of the financial crisis, that wasn't very clever timing. The bonus cultists beat us to it. Lehman Brothers collapsed 3 weeks before this press conference happened in the stock exchange with all those CEOs and chairmen. Nobody listened. There was virtually no press coverage. They only wanted to write about sending Wall Street to jail. Why hasn't that happened, actually? Now I come to think of it. Anyway, next, we didn't give up. We persevered, and we published another report in February of this year where we looked at the effect of the credit crunch on our analysis. We think it's 2015 at the latest that this phenomenon is going to hit us. And this time, we did hit the target, and it did get a lot of coverage in the press. And the government also finally paid a bit of attention. The senior official for energy security asked to speak after we'd finished our press conference, and he said, well, crikey, I paraphrase, but fairly, you know what, we're being told two very different risk narratives here, one by BP et al., who, you know, brackets we used to listen to on the subject of risk, and now a group of other companies that are telling us a different story. We are going to look at this, obviously, as a risk question. And that's continuing today as I speak in Whitehall, and we'll see where it ends up. So to finish, what can I tell you about the crystal ball? It's difficult to peer into it, really, but I think I know one thing, and I'm pretty sure of two others. I know that the technologies and strategies exist to deal with this problem. The problem is that they're just so far behind what we're doing routinely on the road to the left. We need to get to the road to the right, and this is just about energy. There's all sorts of other issues around food as well. I think, I very much suspect that we won't have it within us to do this proactively, to take the risk equation and say, you know what, we should be really accelerating towards this alternative future. I just, you know, I'm a half full, not half empty type of person. I wish I could try and persuade you otherwise. I think we're just simply going to find out who's right in a few years' time, the same way we did with the credit crunch and the far-sighted economists and financial journalists. And the final thing, I suspect, is that ultimately it's not all bad news, because we do have these alternatives and these strategies, and we also have that famous human resilience that my parents tell me about when I recount this story to them, about how fast they mobilized when forced to do so with no alternative in the 1930s and 1940s, and the heroic things that generation achieved then. So I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but I think, though I don't know, that this story ultimately has a happy ending. And that is worth continuing to campaign for. Thank you for listening to me.